Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Braley, did you vote? Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no.
Any other member wish to respond to the call of the roll? Any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will tally the vote.
What's with the TV?
Has Mr. Dingell responded to the vote?
Yes, yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Sarbanes, have you responded to the call?
Yes, Mr. Sarbanes is recorded, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else wish to respond? If not, I think we ought to tally it and let's go. Well, sure, of course.
I'm ready to announce the vote. We held back because Wiener wanted to vote. He was here and then he disappeared and he never come back. So it's okay.
Is the clerk ready to announce the vote?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 19 ayes and 30 nays.
19 ayes, 30 nays. The amendment's not agreed to. Who else has an amendment? Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at desk. It should be 007.
Clerk, well, without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes. And 007, isn't that the secret James Bond?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
I'm trying whatever I can do to help make this bill better. I'm willing to do.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman is
Chairman.
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a similar debate that we've had throughout this day on inherently safer technologies. I guess the frustration on this side is the position that is taken that these companies are not doing all they can to create a safe environment for their employees, be responsible citizens to their neighbors, with regard to, and then with all the other issues of litigation and if something should go wrong with OSHA, with EPA already being in and around these facilities. So our concern, my concern, is that in part of this debate, when we continue to place more costs, rules, and regulations on this industry, we run a very good risk of an eventual decision being made to shut down and go overseas. Now, if anyone believes that, especially in the developing countries and really our competitive challengers from India and China, that they're going to have a more efficient, safer, cleaner technology than they have been following the things that we've done in this committee over the years as far as trying to help provide a safe environment for our citizens. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, chemical manufacturing employment is projected to decline, with wage and salary employment in this sector dropping by 16%. Among the key factors in this decrease are the state of the national and global economy, increased foreign competition, shifting of production overseas, and, quote-unquote, legislation. Inherently safer technologies is inherently subjective and without a widely accepted definition. Our witness last week made it clear that IST is hard to define and that experts have repeatedly testified before Congress that the government should not be in the business of mandating IST because of, and I quote again, significant technical challenges that requires more research. So again, our concern is, here we go, passing rules and regulations when the experts can't agree on a definition, nor do we know what that what that really means. Further, the Department of Homeland Security Deputy Undersecretary testified before the Homeland Security Committee that the DHS has no staff capable of conducting an IST assessment. Let me say that again. The Department of Homeland Security has no staff capable of conducting an IST assessment. Under direct questioning, the Deputy Undersecretary made it very clear that neither the current budget nor the fiscal year 2010 budget included any funding to hire the necessary expertise to review IST assessments and recommend alternative methods for complex engineering processes. Our committee heard testimony that IST is unnecessary to have security at a plant. Clearly, no one at DHS is in a position to dictate to high-risk facilities what engineering process or chemicals should be used to make plastics, prescription drugs, or computer chips. Mandating the theory of IST can be devastating on small businesses. If you eliminate the use of anhydrous ammonia and substituting it with a urea can cost a 1,000-acre farm up to $15,000 per application. That's the importance of what we did with the Mike Ross Amendment. But that's just a study to see the impact. This would be a recurring cost passed on to the consumer. In the current state of our economy, small businesses relying on chemicals simply may not survive. So we've had this debate now over the past couple of weeks, especially with the subcommittee, Mark. Many of us feel that what we're doing here, and my friend from Massachusetts has been placed back in the chair, and I did hear his comments about what he is defining as the real intent of the legislation. I think it's always appropriate for people to talk about the unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences of passing additional regulations in this economy is the real threat of more job losses. So I do have great respect for you, Mr. Markey. I appreciate your position. I just would hope that we would do all we can. And we don't think we're going far enough to protect jobs in the economy, especially in an economy like that. So that's why I ask people to help support this amendment, and I yield back my 9 seconds remaining.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair recognizes himself. And, and that is just to begin by saying that the language in the bill says that implementation of inherently safer technologies can't be required if the facility couldn't continue to operate at its present location. So the bill prevents the offshoring of jobs, just makes it clear that plant has to stay open. According to the Department of Homeland Security, security risk is a function of consequences, vulnerability, and intent. You have to have all three. But ultimately, we want to lower the consequences so that if they are successful, the impact on our country is low. And we want to make the facility safer. Now, many chemical facilities have already done that voluntarily and improving the efficiency and the safety and security of their operations. But this bill isn't about the many good actors. And let me just say this about the chemical industry. There are many, many good actors out there. It's about ensuring that all high-risk chemical facilities are using the safest possible technologies, not just those companies that have been moving voluntarily. Security is more than just guns and gates and guards and intelligence, reaching out into the community and beyond the state where the chemical facility is, trying to prevent an attack from occurring. The Secretary of Homeland Security needs the authority to require a high-risk facility to use safer technologies after proving it is technologically and economically feasible for the facility to do so. And the experts do agree. In 2006, the GAO concluded that implementing inherently safer technologies potentially could lessen the consequences of a terrorist attack by reducing the chemical risks present at facilities, thereby making facilities less attractive targets. And in June 2006, National Academy of Sciences study endorsed safer technologies as the most desirable solution to preventing chemical releases from a terrorist attack. In a February 2007 statement, the Association of American Railroads said it is time for big chemical companies to do their part to help protect America. They should stop manufacturing dangerous chemicals when safer substitutes are available. And if they won't do it, the Congress should do it for them. That's the Association of American Railroads. The language we are voting on has been significantly altered from the as-introduced version and was developed in close consultation with and using significant input from the American Chemistry Council. It contains a robust technical appeal to ensure that the Department of Homeland Security assesses the best information from which to make its decision. It ensures that personnel implications can be considered by the facility in its assessment. The language requires DHS to provide technical assistance and tools for agricultural retailers to conduct their assessments. For facilities regulated under the Marine Transportation Security Act, the language requires consultation with the local Coast Guard captain to ensure that the port's overall security posture is considered before an IST implementation decision is made. Most importantly, the provision now focuses on the highest risk facilities at which a risk of chemical release carries with it the greatest consequence. That has the effect of reducing the number of facilities subject to the IST Implementation Authority from 659 down to 107 nationwide, according to the Department of Homeland Security. But let us be clear. It is, if the inherently safer technology or process costs too much, it doesn't have to be implemented. If there is no feasible inherently safer technology or process, the facility doesn't have to implement one. If implementing the inherently safer technology or process would not reduce the risk at the facility or would shift it elsewhere, it doesn't have to be implemented. The President and Vice President have always been committed to the use of inherently safer technologies when it is possible and feasible. The administration supports the approach that we are taking in these bills. And finally, it should be pointed out that inherently safer technology isn't as expensive as opponents would have you believe. Surveys indicate that switching to safer methods have found that 87% spend less than $1 million, and one half reported spending less than $100,000. And 34% of facilities expected cost savings or improved profitability. 20 big city water utilities adopted a safer and more secure option at a maximum cost of $1.50 per customer per year, less than one bag of potato chips. So this is, in my opinion, a very modest step that we're going to take with huge gains in terms of national security protection. I urge a no vote on the Shimkus Amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, is recognized.
Well, thank you. I ask to strike the last word in support of the amendment. You know, I think this amendment is really the crux of the debate between of the issue between the two sides in support and or against this bill. The following groups oppose the bill: the Agricultural Retailers Association, the American Farm Bureau, despite the amendment that Mr. Ross was able to get through, American Forest and Paper Association, American Petroleum Institute, the American Trucking Association, the Chemical Producers and Distributors Association,
the Consumer Specialty Products Association, the Fertilizer Institute, the Institute of Makers of Explosives, the International Association of Refrigerated Warehouses, the International Liquid Terminals Association, the International Warehouse Logistics Association, the National Agriculture Aviation Association, the National Association of Chemical Distributors, National Associations of Manufacturers, NAM, National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, the National Mining Association, the National Oilseed Processors Association, National Pest Management Association, the National Petrochemical and Refineries Association, the National Propane Gas Association, the North American Millers Association, the Petroleum Equipment Suppliers Association, as well as the Chamber of Commerce. The gentleman from Massachusetts says what is too much? The question has to be asked: what is too much money to comply? It's not defined in this bill. You don't define how many jobs are lost. One of the big issues here, and we heard it again in testimony a couple weeks ago, was that there hasn't been a single inspection at any of these facilities. That's what DHS said. Mr. Gingrey offered an amendment that would have provided 100 inspectors, certified folks that actually can go out and figure out what the deal is. The amendment was rejected on a recorded vote. So what are these organizations going to, what are these facilities going to do? They don't know how much is too much. They have to make plans for the future. Obviously, they want a secure facility. But at the end of the day, they probably go someplace else. And that someplace else, who knows where it is, may have a chain link fence and maybe someone checking the cars or the people that are going through. But that's about it. It's not going to be anything like what we already have in this country and will scare all of these companies, as attributed by this laundry list of different associations that really do have an interest here. We're going to scare them to go someplace where the security is not going to be 10 or even 20% perhaps as good as it is here. So why not take the time, have the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee over the next couple of years, look at what's going on, and figure out and help define what is too much. How many employees are too many that we're going to lose? How many facilities are they going to close? The next bill that we deal with, we know that, it puts in jeopardy 4 facilities around the country, hundreds, if not thousands of employees altogether as it relates to the issue of mercury. So let's take our time and do this bill right. This amendment would go a long way to getting this bill perhaps out of here with some type of a bipartisan support. It makes a lot of sense, and I commend the gentleman from Illinois for offering it. We want security. We want good security here. What this does is, without this amendment, it pushes these facilities someplace else with not nearly the security and puts at risk many communities around the world. Who knows then what happens to those chemicals and other properties that may be then smuggled back here. So.
With the gentleman from Illinois. And just so I can finish up your time, those who have already adopted IST have done it without the government directing them. They've done it because it's good business, it's safe for their workers, it's safe for the community, and they can keep the operation open. So those who have done it did not need government to push them into this direction. The safest refinery for our citizens is the refinery that's not producing in our country. So if we want the safest chemical manufacturing for our citizens, it better be producing in China, or it better be producing in India. And just to give a heads up, because we do need to have a committee-wide vote on IST, Mr. Chairman, I'll call for a recorded vote to give people a heads up that I will do that at the end of this debate.
Yield back.
Excuse me, gentleman's time has required. And again, the chair will just recognize himself. Striking the last word, just to say that, again, the language in the bill says that implementation of inherently safer technology can't be required, cannot be required if the facility couldn't continue to operate at its present location. So just say that, yield back the balance of my time. So the chair is searching for members seeking recognition. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Mr. Chairman, now that I'm here, I'm chagrined that there are not more members here. And I want to make a point of order that a quorum is not present. you have to have a third of the committee here to conduct business at a full committee markup. And my feeble brain doesn't show 20 members here. So I'm going to suggest the lack of a quorum and ask the chair to have a quorum call.
The gentleman from
Although
Texas
you may have them out in the annex.
Has requested a quorum. Will members please stand in a way in which we could recognize them to determine whether or not there is a quorum? Chair counts 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
I'm not real anxious to have my members show up.
19,
I want
20. Mr. Melanson gives us 20.
I want their guys to have to show up, not my guys. But it does show. Did you count 20?
I counted 20. Yeah.
Right, I'll take your word that 20
thank
members.
you. Mr. Engel gives us 21. And it's like Las Vegas here, 21. We went, so we're in good shape here. You know what happened? We started very early this morning. We've been working very, very hard, and we went out and just cast 5 votes out on the House floor. And I think some members could not resist the temptation to try to have lunch. Okay, and it's a conflict, the legislative process and lunch. But that notwithstanding, I think,
But I'm here, Mr. Chairman,
no, and
I want everybody else
And I
here.
think what you were able to do by requesting by doubting the presence of a quorum was for us to establish those here who were able to soldier on, without.
Give them a gold star.
So are there other members seeking recognition? Chair sees none. The roll call then comes on the Shimkus Amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Yes, sir. I'd like
ask for a roll
a recorded vote, please.
The gentleman has requested a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Markey. I'm sorry. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Mr. Kowski. Mr. Kowski, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, aye.
Recognition. Chair sees none. Clerk will report the vote. Oh, the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 14 ayes and 28 nays.
Great. The amendment is defeated. Are there other amendments? The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask that amendment number CVS 017, the CFS. Is that right? CFS?
Okay, the clerk will distribute the amendment to the members for their consideration, and the clerk will then report the amendment to the committee.
Amendment offered by Mr. Upton.
I would ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will not have to read the amendment, and the gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Great. Mr. Chairman, I offered this amendment in subcommittee, and what it does is it turns off the application of IST at a facility if 15% or more of the workforce was laid off in order for the facility to afford making changes required by the bill. The language in the bill, in the underlying bill, currently allows the Secretary to only require implementation of IST if he or she determines that the implementation would not significantly or demonstrably impair the ability of the owner or operator of the covered chemical facility to continue the business of the facility at its location. But nowhere in the bill is there a definition of what is significant. So what this amendment says is if they lay off 15%, that's the standard, and that in essence acts as an escape valve. We debated this at length. I think people understand what it means, and I would be willing at this point to make a deal with the chairman, and that would be to if he allowed this amendment to pass, knowing that he opposed it in subcommittee, if we changed 15% to 20. So if 20% of the, at what level do you think we ought to impose, should we say that there are significant job losses? So I would ask you, if you'll agree to allow this amendment to go by voice, we can, and you can pick the number. I'll give you a choice: 20, 25, or 30 from 15. I yield to my friend, the chairman. So I'm saying that if there's a 30% layoff, then you'll say, yes, that's significant. That ought to be part of the bill. And we'll let it go by voice.
I'm going to hold right now.
You're going to hold?
Yeah. Oh, wait.
You want to see? All right, I have another card. Wait. Oh, all right, I got another card. It's 40. I'm teaming up here with Mr. Stupak on this amendment. Player
so
over here to the right.
we're going to have to.
So you'll pass? You'll pass?
We're going to have to
throw
huddle.
in the cards?
Yeah.
Throw it in?
We're going to huddle on this.
All right, so
we're
I'll
going to
keep
do
it
this
at
Family
15.
Feud style.
All right, I'll keep it at
Stupak
15.
will help me to decide.
I'll keep it at 15, and I would ask that we have a recorded vote.
The gentleman's time has expired. We'll wait for the recorded vote, if the gentleman wouldn't mind, until other members have recognized. His colleague from Michigan, Mr. Stupak, is recognized for that purpose.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I must oppose my friend's amendment because I don't think it makes a lot of sense. It would establish an arbitrary rule, and you said make it any number we want, but that even whatever number we want, the arbitrary rule that a facility is exempt from inherently safer technology requirements if Secretary determines that complying with the security requirements of this bill would reduce the facility workforce by 15% or 40% wherever it's going to be. Basically, in short, what this amendment creates is an incentive to a facility to lay off workers. With unemployment over 9% and 15% in our state, that's the last thing we ought to be doing. But the bill before us takes really a different and more balanced approach to the issue of inherent safer technology. It recognizes that in some cases a chemical facility can reduce the consequences of a potential terrorist attack by using safer chemicals or processes, and a safer facility is less likely to be a desirable target in the first place. That's why the bill gives the Secretary the authority to decide whether certain high-risk facilities should switch to safer technologies. However, the bill goes on to say, and it recognizes that the use of safer chemicals and processes might not be possible in all cases. That's why underneath the bill, the Secretary can order a switch to safer technology only after proving it's technologically and economically feasible for a facility to do this. The bill also ensures that chemical facilities provide the Secretary with information about personnel implications before implementing inherently safer technology. In this way, the Secretary can consider all aspects in the decision on a specific facility before taking action. The bill is clear. If the facility can show implementing a safer technology will force the facility to shut down or lay off significant portions of the workforce, the facility will not have to implement the safer technology. And I understand the gentleman's concern, but the amendment purports to be concerned with preserving jobs, but the labor community, which enthusiastically supports the bill, opposes this amendment. I have with me, and I'd like to submit for the record, a letter from the Communications Workers of America and the UAW, which wrote that it opposes amendments that purport to protect jobs, but in fact only hinder implementation of methods to reduce the consequences of a terrorist attack. So, I mean, the idea behind this one is for safer. Time up? Oh, okay. Just checking. I heard the gavel. It purports that we're going to do safer process to protect us. In this letter from UAW and CWA, besides, they said we oppose the attempt to exempt small businesses, that some of these high-risk facilities put 12 million people at risk. I mean, the reason why we have this bill is because of risk. We can use the jobs argument, but the unions that are opposed to it, who have the workers working there, they're saying that's not the reason why we do it. We're doing this technology to make us all safer, especially when you have some of these high-risk facilities that may put 12 million people at risk. Is it really a jobs issue or a risk issue? And we think there's enough safeguards in the legislation to protect jobs, and I would hope that we would oppose the amendment. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Great. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are there other members seeking recognition on the Upton Amendment? Chair sees none.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to put this letter in the record without objection. May I put it in?
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr.
Will
Chairman.
be included. The vote then comes on the Upton Amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
I think we better have a roll call.
The gentleman from Michigan requests a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey.
Nope.
Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Ms. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Ms. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shadegg? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Ms. Bono-Mack? Ms. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes aye.
Seeking recognition for the purpose of being recorded. Chair sees none. The clerk will report the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 11 ayes and 28 noes.
The amendment is defeated. Are there other amendments? The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have amendment, and it's, let's see, SCS 003 at the desk. It's not my 40% amendment.
The clerk will distribute the amendment of the gentleman from Michigan, and the clerk will report the amendment to the committee.
Amendment offered by Mr. Upton to H.R. 2868.
I'll ask you now
Strike
to
section
consent that it be
21.
considered as read.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as having been read, and the gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes for the purpose of.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am going to ask for a recorded vote for those members that are here and don't intend to take a lot of time. We discussed this similar amendment as it was on the bill earlier that we on the water bill a little bit earlier this morning. This amendment strikes section 2116, entitled Citizen Suits. The text of the bill allows any person to commence a civil action against the Secretary alleging a violation of the law or against the Secretary for failure to enforce the law, and also citizen suits against federal facilities. Allowing anyone, including a terrorist, to file a civil lawsuit against the Secretary against federal facilities will undoubtedly lead to a sharp increase in litigation and, frankly, the sharing of information that we may not want to be shared with folks that may intend to do harm to that facility down the road. The administration, when they testified before the House Homeland Security Committee, that third-party lawsuits may in fact lead to the release of sensitive and protected information, led to their surmise that they didn't want it, that they didn't request this language in there. So I'm not sure where it came from. It didn't come from the Homeland Security administration either. They didn't necessarily want it either. So here it is in this bill. We've debated this in subcommittee. We debated it on earlier bills as well. I'd like to think that we may be able to strike this from the underlying legislation. And again, would ask members to stay because we're going to have a recorded vote on it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes herself in opposition to the amendment. This amendment would strip citizen suits out of the bill, even though we already eliminated the private right of action against privately owned chemical facilities. And the citizen suit provision contains two critical components that have everything to do with ensuring implementation of the statute and nothing to do with lawsuits against chemical facilities. First, the bill allows suits against the Secretary for failing to perform non-discretionary duties or meeting statutory deadlines such as promulgation of regulations. Citizens and even industry can use these suits to force agency action if DHS does not do what Congress directed it to do. And second, the bill allows suits against federal facilities to ensure that orders are enforced. For example, last year in our own backyard, the Attorney General of Maryland had to file a citizen suit to enforce an order to clean up a site at Fort Meade. And neither of these types of suits raises any concern about the public release of sensitive security information as the result of a lawsuit against a chemical facility. The citizen suit provision, as modified in this bill, represents a compromise designed to promote effective enforcement of the Act while ensuring that sensitive information is not at risk. The American Chemistry Council, the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates, and environmental and labor groups all support this compromise language. And in fact, even the Chamber of Commerce told our staff that this provision is better than the original provision because it's a compromise provision. And so I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. And the chair yields back. Any further comments? Mr. Barton.
I want to support the amendment. I want to ask the council a question. If this provision stays in and this bill becomes law, could a citizen sue a facility for lack of a security guard system?
No, they could not. Under the section in the bill, suits can only be brought against the Secretary for the failure to perform a non-discretionary act or against a federal facility to enforce an order that has already issued and become effective under this act.
Okay, if a citizen knew that there was an employee of a facility that gave secure information to a terrorist organization, could that citizen sue under this provision?
That citizen could report that violation through the petition process, but suits are only available under this section against the Secretary.
So it couldn't sue?
Not under this section. There could be a petition.
Okay. So we're trying to enhance security, but the whole purpose of the citizens trying to encourage or security, they can't sue. Is that correct?
Because of information protection concerns in the subcommittee, suits against private companies were taken out of the citizen suit provision and replaced with the citizen petition provision in the new section 2117. Under that provision, the Secretary promulgates regulations to set up a petition process by which citizens can file a petition alleging a specific violation by a specific facility. The department would be required to respond to those petitions according to their regulations.
Okay. Well, I thank the council for that. It would seem to me that we're setting up a situation here so that we can have something close to a frivolous lawsuit simply to encourage litigation with no real thought to protecting security. So I'm not sure the purpose of it, Madam Chairwoman. I don't really see in this instance why we need citizen suits of any type. So I would think I would support the amendment. And if
Gentleman yield.
I'd be happy to yield. I'm trying to figure this out.
Let me ask, under Section 2116, I'd ask counsel, can anyone sue these companies? Can you explain to all of us how it'll work?
Under Section 2116, there are no suits available against private companies whatsoever. The only suits that are available can be brought by any citizen who can show standing under constitutional standing requirements against the Secretary of Homeland Security for the failure to perform a non-discretionary act or against a federal facility to enforce an order that has already become effective under this act.
Yeah, what staff, Mr. Barton, what the staff is saying is the purpose of this is to make sure, A, that the laws are enforced and the deadlines are enforced, or B, primarily that, really, as happened in Maryland last year where they just simply were not enforcing the law. So the purpose of this section is not to encourage citizen suits against companies. It's to make sure that the laws are enforced.
Would the gentleman yield for 1 second to my colleague?
Sure.
My point is, isn't that our job? I mean, if our constituents are ticked off at a federal agency that they're not doing their job, isn't that our job? We're going to allow citizens to sue us, the federal government? Well, that's us. We're going to fund them. So I'm saying that if we were doing our jobs and we had these facilities in our backyards and we knew our constituents, we would be at the front gate of these facilities versus allowing citizens to sue the executive branch of the federal government.
Well, my last 13 seconds. Can you sue the EPA under this provision? Or is it only the Department of Homeland Security?
This title doesn't impose any non-discretionary duties on EPA, so the suits would only be available against the Secretary of Homeland Security for failures to perform the non-discretionary acts that are created and required by this title.
Well, I thought there might be some benefit if we could sue the EPA, but it's just DHS. I yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
Is there any other discussion of this amendment? If not, the clerk will call the roll. I assume the gentleman continues in his request. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess? Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Wiener? Wiener votes no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Madam Chairman, the ayes are 15 and the nays are 28.
Great. Are there other amendments? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, number CFS 008, on sensitive information.
The clerk will distribute the paper associated with the amendment and will verbally report the amendment to the committee.
Amendment offered by Mr. Barton to H.R. 2868. In Section 2110B3.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as having been read, and the gentleman from Texas will be recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had this amendment at subcommittee, but I want to reoffer it again at full committee. Under the current bill language, the standard for prosecution changes from knowingly or recklessly, that's the current standard, to a new undefined standard, purposefully. Now, minority staff can find no record in current federal statute of a purposeful standard. However, the knowingly or recklessly standard is in several existing statutes. Most recently, the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act, which passed this committee and became public law back in 2002. At subcommittee, when I offered the amendment, the majority response against it was that knowingly or recklessly an employee at one of the covered facilities might give information to a first responder or local law enforcement and could be prosecuted because of giving that information to first responders or local law enforcement officials. That is simply not the case. The bill before us has a specific exclusion for such purposes. If we substitute the word purposefully as the standard for prosecution for the existing standard of knowingly or recklessly, you make it virtually impossible to ever prosecute someone for releasing this confidential and in some cases classified information, because you would have to prove in court that the individual in question intentionally, purposefully gave the information hoping that it would be, or intending that it be misused. I think this is ludicrous. We are, in the guise of enhancing security, we are weakening the very standard for prosecution that currently exists, making it, in my opinion, virtually impossible that we would ever prosecute someone who aided and abetted a terrorist organization. So this is one case that I would hope the majority would carefully consider and support this amendment. It actually enhances the bill, if you're a supporter of it, because it would make it possible to actually prosecute people who released information that they shouldn't be releasing. So I'm a strong supporter of the amendment and would urge its adoption.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition on the Barton Amendment? The gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in opposition to this amendment and want to respond directly to the gentleman's arguments for making this change. First of all, in this bill before us, we already strengthen the penalties for unlawful disclosure of protected information. Under current law, under the current program, information protection violations are punishable only through civil penalties. The bill before us today, under the provisions, those who illegally disclose protected information can face criminal penalties. People who purposefully disclose information improperly could go to prison for a year or be fined up to $100,000. And that's exactly how we should treat people who purposely disclose and intentionally disclose protected security information. The gentleman argues further that he can find no other uses of the term purposefully in other statutes, and I would point the gentleman to a few provisions of the U.S. Code. 10 U.S.C. Section 948A defines as an unlawful combatant as someone who has, quote, engaged in hostility or who has purposefully and materially supported hostilities against the U.S. We find another citation at 7 U.S.C. Section 136H, and another one yet again at 8 U.S.C. Section 1182. Now, I also want to just point out the plain impact of possibly accepting an amendment like this, and that is the chilling effect that it has on the type of sharing of information that we actually want to encourage in this bill. Information sharing between first responders and facility managers, employees and government officials, because of the potential fear of large fines or imprisonment if we change the standard in the bill before us. So just to restate quickly, because we're going from a civil to a criminal penalty, I think it is very important that we are requiring a purposeful and intentional disclosure to merit those type of penalties. And I would strongly urge that we not accept this amendment, that we vote against this amendment, because of the chilling effect that it would have on the type of information sharing that is so critical to our public safety.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, is recognized.
I'd like to strike the last word in support of the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
Let me yield to Mr. Barton.
I just want to comment on what the gentlelady from Wisconsin just said. She basically avoided the question by saying we don't have to worry about the standard because we've increased the penalties. Well, if you put in place a standard that's unenforceable, you could have the death penalty, I guess, because it's never going to be enforced. And I do want to compliment her on somebody researching and finding the words purposeful in some federal statute. We couldn't do it, so I'm going to have my hat off to your researcher for finding that. I would ask the council, is there an indication that the statute that the gentlelady just quoted has ever been enforced, has ever been used?
I have no information about that at this time.
Okay, I'll ask the author of the information if she's aware that that statute's ever been used.
There were 3 sections of U.S. Code that I cited. I quoted one word for word, but not the other 2. And I cannot answer the question about whether there's been a court case on that. But we did find those 3 uses of the purposeful standard
well, I would,
in U.S. Code. So
reclaiming Mr. Upton's time, in listening to your citation, it appeared to me that those were statutes, and this is an assumption, I'm not saying that this is the fact, that might deal with treason or something like that. If in fact,
if the gentleman will yield,
yeah.
I can give you one of them certainly does deal in the arena of hostilities against the U.S. One deals with people looking for information on pesticides, and the other is relating to, let's see, prohibits the Secretary of State from giving waivers of certain blanket national security immigration bans to groups that have engaged in terrorist activity or purposefully engaged in a pattern and practice of terrorist activity.
Well,
so,
my point is, if somebody with a submachine gun bursts into this committee room and points the gun at the chairman and pulls the trigger, it's obvious that his purpose is to harm the chairman. I mean, he is engaged in an overt act of aggression. Somebody who is in charge of information at a chemical plant and releases or puts that information in a situation where it can be obtained, it's pretty hard to prove that that person's purpose was harmful intent. So I will grant the gentlelady that she's done an excellent job of finding in statute the word purposefully, but I will still stipulate that if you use it in this instance, you make the implementation and enforcement of the law virtually impossible. And so I would still ask that my amendment be accepted, because if you're a proponent of the legislation, you should want a standard that is enforceable if necessary, and changing from knowingly and recklessly to purposefully renders that implementation and enforcement, in my opinion, impossible. And I thank Mr. Upton for yielding to me.
You want your own time, Nathan, or do you want a minute of mine? What? I'll let Mr. Deal get 5 minutes.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from the Black's Law Dictionary, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to support the amendment, and I think a decent respect for the opinion of my colleagues obliges me to explain the reason why. I am going to respectfully disagree with Mr. Barton's statement that the proposed language makes it impossible to prosecute. I do think it makes it very difficult to prosecute, though, and I think we ought to distinguish between prosecuting and punishing careless disclosures and prosecuting and punishing intentional disclosures, because there's a significant difference between the two. However, if the consequences of disclosure are serious enough, you might want to deter negligent disclosures every bit as much as you want to disclose intentional disclosures. It is true you will find the purposeful and the knowing standards used at various places throughout the criminal code. I think you'll find the knowing disclosure standard more prevalent, because most of the time we're dealing with things where the consequences of the action that you want to discourage are serious enough so that you don't care if it was a negligent act that resulted in the harm or an intentional act that resulted in a harm. If the harm is big enough, you want to deter it under either one of these two possible causation scenarios. A very wise old judge once said, even a dog knows the difference between being tripped over and being kicked. And it's true. A dog does know the difference between the two, but if the consequences of the dog are just as painful, you might want to deter both. You might want to discourage folks from tripping over the dog or from kicking the dog. We hearken back to the days of World War II and remember the code word, the words on everybody's lips: loose lips sink ships. That wasn't trying to deal with folks acting as Nazi spies. It was to try and discourage people from being careless around the presence of Nazi spies, because you couldn't be sure one was going to be. The whole idea of loose lips sink ships is that even the careless person can result in catastrophic harm if the consequences of the information you have are important enough. So I'm going to go, because I think the better and stronger argument is with trying to discourage both negligent disclosures as well as intentional disclosures, and having the knowing standard in there doesn't require that you know it's going to hurt somebody. It's just you ought to know better than to be talking about something you're supposed to keep secret. If loose lips can sink ships, we want to deter people from blabbing about things they should keep secret. If they have an obligation to keep it secret, our punishments and our penalties should follow and attach to the conduct we want to discourage. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Deal.
Well, I want to compliment my colleague from Georgia. He preempted a little bit about what I was going to say, because I think that what we're talking about here is, as it is written, we're talking only about a knowing violation. And I would point out that even with a knowing, purposeful violation, it is only a misdemeanor punishment that is attached under this section. The highest classification of in the negligence category is, in fact, that which is reckless. It's not ordinary negligence. It is a higher classification of negligence. And I think the amendment is appropriate, and I would urge its adoption. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick reply, because I listened to the gentleman from Georgia speaking of loose lips sinking ships. But we have an instance in this bill where in some circumstances we want the sharing of information, and the lack of that sharing of information can sink ships also. If first responders don't know what they need when they arrive on the scene, we can lose lives that way too. And what we have heard from the EPA in particular, based on the Bioterrorism Act, is where this recklessness standard has existed. They've simply locked up this information, kept it under key, not had appropriate sharing of information. So this is, we've had testimony that this type of language have a chilling effect, where we want to encourage the sharing of information. It just works both ways. This is about striking a balance, and I think the balance is to increase the penalties, make it criminal, as well as very significant fine involved, but keep the purposefulness standard.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition on this amendment? Chair sees none. The the vote then comes on the amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The gentleman from Michigan requests a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no.
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, no.
Are any other members seeking recognition for the purpose of being recorded? The chair sees none. The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 19 and the nays were 28.
The amendment is defeated. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Deal.
Move to strike the last word, and I'd like to have a colloquy with counsel.
The gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
Counsel, if you would look on page 36 of the manager's amendment relating to the question of whether or not a company that submits a plan, a security plan, whether or not it is considered adequate. If it is not considered adequate by the Secretary, that subsection A says that the owner or operator may appeal the Secretary's determination. To whom is that appeal addressed? And what is the procedure that would be followed?
Reading section A, it says, after providing notice to the owner or operator of the covered chemical facility and an opportunity for such owner or operator to appeal the Secretary's determination. This does not specify who the appeal would be to. I believe that would be set in regulations, but my guess would be that it's to an ALJ within the department. I think that would be interpreted by the department in the regulation setting process.
So it could be an administrative law judge, or it could just be asking the Secretary, would you please reconsider?
I think that would have to be hammered out in the regulation setting process.
Okay. The next thing it says is, on that same paragraph, is may issue an order assessing a civil penalty. On the next page, on page 37, there are two categories of penalties. The first is the civil penalty, which it says a court may assess a civil penalty of up to $50,000 per day. And then below that, that the Secretary may assess an administrative penalty, which is half that amount, $25,000 a day. Which is it? Is the Secretary entitled to assess a civil penalty, which by definition is $50,000 in one section saying only a court can do that, or is it a penalty that is appropriately perhaps called an administrative penalty, which is $25,000?
I believe it is the latter. Under paragraph B, the Secretary may award administrative penalties only up to $25,000, and because the penalty in paragraph A, which you're referring to, would be assessed by the Secretary, that would be limited to $25,000.
I would suggest in consideration before this moves forward that since the term civil penalty has an internal definition in this statute, that if that's the intent, then it should say administrative penalty rather than civil penalty, which I think that's the intent, but I would just point it out, ought to be considered.
Okay,
I yield back.
Okay, we will work with the gentleman to ensure that the language reflects the goal. Thank you. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time? Chair sees none. If not, the question comes on the manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now move that the committee report HR, the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the manager's amendment rather, is adopted. And now we move to that the committee report H.R. 2868 as amended with the recommendation that the bill pass. All in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that I would ask a roll call vote.
Gentleman from Texas requests a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey.
Votes aye.
Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Wiener. Mr. Wiener, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Shadig. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes no. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack, no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, no. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, no. Okay. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? If so, the clerk will tally the vote and announce it.
Ready. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 29, the nays were 18.
29 yes, 18 no. The ayes have it, and the motion's agreed to. Chair now calls up H.R. 2190, the Mercury Pollution Reduction Act. This bill, as amended, was reported by the Subcommittee on Commerce, Trade, and Consumer Protection. Ms. Schakowsky, you seek recognition. First of all, without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, that will be the order. Ms. Schakowsky, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word so I can say a few words about
Then the
this
ladies
bill.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. I wanted to speak to the bill I've sponsored, H.R. 2190, which deals with the dangers associated with exposure to mercury. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, mercury pollution can do irreparable damage to cognitive functioning in adults and to infants developing nervous systems. It's so dangerous that the federal government has warned pregnant women and those who may become pregnant not to eat fish with high levels of mercury, such as swordfish, and to severely limit their consumption of others, such as tuna. The bill we're considering, H.R. 2190, goes a long way toward protecting the public's health from exposure to mercury pollution by requiring that within 2 years of enactment, chloralkali plants in the United States that use harmful and antiquated mercury cell process for producing chlorine switch to other existing technologies that are much safer for the environment and already available. It does not, as some have argued, require the closure of plants or the elimination of jobs. Rather, it mandates the transition from one technology to another. This type of action is not without precedent. In 1996, the Congress passed Mercury-Containing and Rechargeable Battery Management Act, which phased out the use of mercury in batteries. It's also important to note that PBG and Olin have already converted other plants without eliminating jobs. Further, this bill is critical because while only 4 chlor-alkali plants in the United States continue to use mercury, their impact on surrounding communities is severe and, even worse, unnecessary. Unlike coal-fired power plants, there are readily available alternatives that these companies can and should be using. In fact, converting from mercury cell to membrane cell technology has proven to not only be drastically better for the environment, but also a wise business practice, saving companies millions of dollars in energy efficiency savings. Opponents of this bill will argue that 2 years is not enough to convert, and the facts bear otherwise. PPG, one of the 3 companies in the United States that still use this antiquated technology, completed a conversion of their Louisiana plant in 23 months. Having said that, as we begin today's markup, I want to reiterate to my colleagues that I am open to extending the timeline for conversion. That is why my staff and I have spent hours meeting with and talking directly to the chlor-alkali industry and with the staff of other members. Ultimately, a compromise must maintain the goal of this bill, however, which is to protect the public's health from unnecessary exposure to mercury pollution. The industry's stated position of an extension of 7 to 9 years fails to uphold this goal, and therefore I can't support it. I introduced this legislation because I believe that Congress has a responsibility to minimize the public's exposure to mercury pollution, especially when cleaner, safer alternatives exist. I urge my colleagues to support its passage, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Are there any amendments to the legislation? Mr. Gingrey, you have an amendment at the desk?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
This amendment is MERC 09 subscript 007.
Okay. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2190 offered by Mr. Gingrey. Ms.
Without
Blackburn,
objection, the amendment will
Mr.
be
Murphy.
considered as read. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I, along with every other member of this committee, believe that this is critically important that we protect all Americans from harmful exposure to mercury. However, like a number of my colleagues, I'm significantly troubled by the direction of this underlying legislation. Specifically, H.R. 2190 seeks to ban the mercury cell manufacturing process that is currently only utilized by 4 chlor-alkali plants across the country. The 3 companies that will be affected by this bill, Ashta Chemicals, the Olin Corporation, and PPG, all have unequivocally stated that H.R. 2190, as currently written, would force the closure of 4 chlor-alkali plants in Georgia, Tennessee, Ohio, and West Virginia, and would result in over 1,000 manufacturing workers losing their jobs. During these challenging economic times, the last thing that this committee needs to do is willfully adding to the unemployment rolls, particularly when the communities in which these plants are located are already experiencing unemployment rates at disproportionately high levels. Mr. Chairman, in my hometown of Augusta, Georgia, the unemployment rate is now 10.3%. In Ashtabula County, Ohio, the unemployment rate is 13.5%. In Wetzel County, West Virginia, 13.5% of the community is out of work. And lastly, in Bradley County, Tennessee, 10.1% of the people do not have a job. In addition to adding over 1,000 to the unemployment rolls, it will cost each of these communities millions of dollars in payroll and economic impact each year. In Augusta alone, Olin accounts for $9 million in payroll and close to $25 million in additional goods and services for the community. That's one of the reasons why they used to refer this area as the Miracle Mile. But at a time when communities like these are struggling, we should not be compounding their economic hardship, and H.R. 2190 would do just that. Mr. Chairman, that's why I, along with my colleague from Pennsylvania, Dr. Tim Murphy, my colleague from Tennessee, Ms. Marsha Blackburn, are offering this amendment today. We understand the need to balance the dangers that mercury presents with the economic needs of our local communities. This amendment represents the compromise that the industry stakeholders feel is a reasonable timeline by which they can make a decision to invest, on average, $100 million to convert from the mercury cell manufacturing process. Under the Gingrey-Murphy-Blackburn amendment, these plants would have until the end of 2015 to make this decision. If the plant chooses to convert, it must complete that conversion by the end of 2018. Now, if the plant chooses not to convert, as they might, it must cease its operation within 1 year, by the end of 2016. Furthermore, Mr. Chairman, this amendment ensures that these plants cannot game the system. Under our amendment, these facilities must certify with the EPA their desire to convert technologies, and failure to do so would result in criminal penalties. Mr. Chairman, we believe that this amendment represents a good faith compromise with industry stakeholders where we can accomplish the goals of the bill. And I commend the gentle lady from Illinois and what she is trying to do. I mean, I absolutely commend those goals. But we can do it without jeopardizing the livelihood of over 1,000 hardworking Americans at these 4 facilities. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. It's not just that it's my hometown. I think about all these other jobs in these other 3 states and communities, and if it's not necessary, if we can achieve the goal and just give them a little more time. In fact, in Europe, Mr. Chairman, their voluntary deadline for conversion is 2020. So under the terms of this amendment to Ms. Schukowsky's bill, we would be getting this done by 2018. And I think that it's a very reasonable amendment. I urge all my colleagues to support it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair would like to recognize himself in opposition to the amendment. The chlorine industry in this country is almost at the end of a transition. 95% of the industry now uses mercury-free technology. They've proven what the industry can do to modernize its facilities when they want to. Unfortunately, just 4 facilities have not been modernized, and they continue to spew mercury into our communities. It's time to set a deadline for action. Unfortunately, this amendment would prolong mercury pollution from these few facilities, leading to years of unnecessary harm to workers, their families, and especially children. It would delay the timeline for deciding to convert or close a facility until 2015, and it would delay facilities from actually having to convert to mercury-free technology until 2018 or even 2020. So I with all due respect, think this amendment takes us in the wrong direction. We know they don't need until the end of 2015, more than 6 years from today, to make a decision about whether or not to modernize. It's clear that it's time to transition away from the polluting technology of the past. Japan got rid of its mercury-based facilities in 1986. India will complete its transition to mercury-free technology by 2012. China doesn't even have one mercury-based facility. The question is simply whether we're going to ask these communities to endure needlessly additional years of pollution from these facilities. I'd urge members to oppose this amendment and to support the bill that's before us. Further discussion? Yes, Mr. Murphy.
Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a co-sponsor of this amendment, I'd like to comment on a couple of elements of this. First of all, to make sure we understand that these companies are going to move towards eliminating their mercury productions. However, it takes time to do that and a good deal of money. Estimates are $100 million would be necessary to convert each of the remaining facilities. 2, why are they asking for more time? Well, because right now, with the markets low, with the economy as it is, one of the questions they have is, are they going to keep these plants open or not, period? And will it be worth it for them to make that $100 million investment? If it turns out that as the economy recovers, these other demands are not out there, and then that decision will be made. If it turns out they can't get that money together, that decision will be made. The idea is to let the businesses work with us so that we can move towards that mercury-free level. Now, it's also important to understand that it allows for the financing and building to take place so we can move forward on all these elements and want that to happen. Further, this Congress and this committee was involved in making other requirements for compact fluorescent bulbs. Compact fluorescent bulbs, not made in this country, as we recognize is happening, and we've lost a lot of jobs from that. However, they contain mercury. And the mercury from those and the disposal of that is presenting an environmental hazard which was created by this committee and by Congress with those requirements. So we recognize we have to move forward with eliminating some of the mercury from the atmosphere, but it is going to take some work. What we're asking here is some time to make these transitions so these companies can move forward with this. They can raise $100 million, and they don't have to close these plants, which, by the way, is 1,000 jobs. And as we look to continue to see jobs lost in this country, reaching levels that none of us want to see, it is important that we understand that public health also must take into account the health of families to have jobs to move forward and to take care of themselves here. So along these lines, we're asking not to stop the elimination of mercury, and not to eliminate that, but to say let's do this in a way that gives these companies a chance to make this transition. The conversion cost of $100 million to make some business decisions on how this can be done, to see if we can salvage these 1,000 jobs, and to let the people who do this for a living make the decision. I don't think any of us on this committee know what it takes to convert a chlor-alkali plant or to make the decisions necessary with regard to the chemical decisions, the chemistry, and the science and technology involved with this decision. Let's turn to the companies that are going to move forward in this. They want to move forward on this, but the question is need the time to make this happen. And for that reason, for the sake of jobs, for the sake of cleaning up the environment, and the sake of, once again, not sending these jobs overseas, I ask this committee support this. And with that, I yield.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. I mean, he made the comment that nobody really knows how long it takes for a conversion or what it costs. And I have, figures here that I would like to share with my colleagues that the Olin company that owns the plant in Augusta, Georgia, just recently completed a conversion of one of these facilities using mercury cell technology in St. Gabriel, Louisiana. Did I say that correctly, Mr. Scalise? Gabriel, St. Gabriel, Louisiana. 3 years it took to convert, and $170 million. I thank the gentleman for giving me the opportunity to give those figures.
Thank you very much. And again, that's more information on what it takes to convert these plants. And
would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will yield.
Just to highlight, throughout the day we've been listening to from the Department of Homeland Security, EPA. We've taken their word on language of bills and stuff, and I would just take the word of these companies that say passage of this bill would force the closure of 4 chlor-alkali plants in Georgia, Tennessee, Ohio, and West Virginia, and would result in over 1,000 manufacturing workers losing their jobs, along with increased costs to customers and consumers. So here's a great opportunity to either vote for jobs or vote against jobs, for facilities being open or for closing facilities. In this environment, I'm going to side with keeping them open.
Thank you. And with that, I also note that the issue with the light bulbs and the phasing out of those is going to, in the next couple of years, we're going to have an increased mercury bulb content in this nation, too. And this, while that is happening, these plants need some time to remove mercury from their plants. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Ms. Schakowsky, you seek recognition?
Yes, I move to strike the last word. If I could, I have listened carefully to the arguments of my friends, Mr. Gingrey and Mr. Murphy, and I know Ms. Blackburn is also on this amendment. And I want to reiterate that I'm not opposed to revisiting the timeline of this bill. But moving the date of conversion to 2018 presents a tremendous threat to the communities in which these facilities exist. And I want my colleagues to consider this fact. Every year that the conversion deadline is delayed, what would represent, at a minimum, an additional 700 pounds of mercury emitted into the air and waterways. that would represent an additional 4,900 pounds of mercury pollution that is completely preventable. I wanted to just comment on what the danger to children is, especially. Infants and children exposed to high doses of mercury may have problems with attention span, language, visual spatial skills, memory and coordination, brain damage, speech problems, seizures, blindness, and mental retardation. So we are trying to balance here the jobs and the danger to the public. And so I would just suggest that 2018 is not a timeline that I think that our communities and our children can tolerate, and I would urge a no vote on the amendment. I yield. Yes, I would yield to the gentleman. Yes.
I thank the gentlelady very much, and you know I'm trying to be sensitive here to the concerns which the proponents of the amendment have. We're not talking about the first 5% of facilities that have to be converted. We're now talking about the final 5%. 95% have already been converted. So this is just the final of the entire industry having made the switch. And one of the things that we have learned from all of the other switches that have occurred up until now is that when you remove the mercury, it does improve energy efficiency by 37%. So you're making money there. It boosts short-term jobs and increases long-term competitiveness because now you have something that's in the mainstream of the global competitive mercury-free marketplace that has been created that the chairman made reference to. And it subsequently increases the chances of saving chlorine industry jobs because you've moved to what the industry standard is. In the past, some factories have converted in as short a period of time as 18 months. That happened in the Westlake chemical facility in Kentucky, who also did that during poor economic times. I think what I hear the gentlelady saying is that she's willing to negotiate, but that 2018 is just too far beyond. It's almost 10 years from now to make a conversion that at that point the entire industry would have 95% of the industry would have already completed by 10 or 12 years by then. So I think it's an invitation to try to find a date, but I would recommend to the members that the 2018 date, given what the industry has already done, given we're only talking about the final 5% of the entire industry, really is too much of a hazard to allow to occur with 4,200 to 12,000 pounds of mercury pollution that is currently preventable, that would be put into waterways, put into the atmosphere during that period of time. So I would just recommend that you have a negotiation to find a date that makes some sense, because this number just is too far beyond what I think a reasonable person looking at this issue would accept. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
And I thank the gentleman, and I yield back.
Are we ready for the question? The vote now comes on the...
Mr. Chairman.
Who
Mr.
seeks
Chairman.
recognition?
Move to strike the last
gentlelady from
word.
Tennessee. Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that we all know that we support protecting Americans from harmful exposures to mercury, but the direction and the policy of the bill is troubling to some of us. The Olin plant in Cleveland, Tennessee is the one that I speak about directly. And with my opening statement today, I had a letter from our Democratic governor of the state of Tennessee who wrote to us expressing concern over the actions that would be taken in 2190 and asking that we be very, very careful in that. The payroll at Olin, the impact that that has on the community, the 400 jobs that are there, their annual payroll is $48 million. That is a plant that has been in place for nearly 50 years, and it does play a very important role in that economy. Now, we all know that this is a difficult time, and transition is going to be very difficult. They're asking simply for some understanding and a little additional time. So that is why this amendment would do three very specific things.
It forces companies that make chlorine or caustic soda using the mercury cell process to certify by 2015 whether they want to convert technology. The EPA estimates that conversion cost is $100 million. We know there's an example of another facility that spent $107 million. The timeline gives the companies the necessary time to weather the current financial situation and come forward with a very strong plan. Now, for companies that don't wish to stay in the chlorine making business, they have to stop using that technology within 1 year by the end of 2016. For companies that do want to convert to another process, this amendment would give those plants 3 years to make that transition. The timeline is consistent with past industry conversion efforts. And lastly, if a company is making good faith efforts to convert, but hits a snag with permitting, financing, or building, this amendment gives the plant the opportunity to go back to the
Now want some more time. Generally yields back the balance for time. Are we ready to proceed to a vote? We'll now vote on the amendment before us, offered by Mr. Gingrey, Ms. Blackburn, and Mr. Murphy. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I would like a recorded vote, please.
Gentlemen request a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes no. I'm sorry, Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Engel? Engel, no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Harmon? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Inslee? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Barton.
Aye.
Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt.
Aye.
Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? If so, the clerk will tally the vote and announce it. Clerk will announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 19 and the nays were 26.
19 ayes, 26 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments? What did you say? Mr. Melanson, do you have an amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2190 offered by Ms. Melanson of Louisiana, page 5, line 12.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of the concern, which I have also for the possibility of causing hardship on a company that provides good jobs for people, regardless of which state it's in, I bring forth an amendment that would allow that by 2012, a decision would have to be made on the closing of the plant or the conversion of the plant. So working on this bill, and the premise right now in 2009 to 2010, that's at least 3 years' opportunity before they have to make the decision. And since I'm sure the stimulus will have turned the economy around, hopefully things will be better and they'll look to make the conversion. But in the light of what the bill provides, this amendment would provide, the decision would have to be made by 2012. They would have to close starting in 2013. If they choose to convert, it would be 2015. So the conversion would give them 3 years from 2012 and 3 years from the date that we're having this discussion. So roughly about 6 years with 3 years opportunity to make the decision on which they want to do. With that,
would the gentleman yield to me?
Yes, I would.
Thank you for yielding. It seems to me that your amendment is a sensible compromise between the current language of the bill, ceasing use of mercury in chlor-alkali production 24 months after enactment, and the amendment we just discussed to delay the modernization of these plants until 2018 or even 2020. Most plants that have already converted did so within 2 years. Westlake Chemical in Kentucky converted in as short as 18 months, and all three affected companies have indicated they could modernize within 3 years. The issue is the date to decide to convert. So I'm sympathetic to the current economic climate. However, I believe that companies will have sufficient time under your amendment, and the timelines you propose are technologically and economically feasible, and I would urge all my colleagues to support your amendment.
Reclaiming my time, I thank you for that, Mr. Chairman, and I echo that sentiment. The plant that was closed in my district was done in less than 2 years.
And will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank you for the amendment. I, too, agree that this is a reasonable timeline for plans to make a decision and then to proceed. I appreciate the concern that this amendment expresses towards the job consequences, and I will support the effort, obviously, to be conscious of making sure that these plants have adequate time to make decisions and to make changes as they see fit. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Sutton. Yes.
I just have a question for the gentleman. I appreciate that. You had mentioned the 2-year time frame should be adequate. Has anyone, have you had a chance to talk with any of these companies that have these plants, for example, the one in Ashtabula, Ohio, or the one in Georgia, to find out if they could comply with this time?
I've talked with the plant people that have the facility in mind, that I think also own the Georgia facility. Of course, they would like more time because of the economy right now. But as I said, this is 3 years out, and who knows, in 2018 you might be back in the same bad economy again. But this gives them roughly 3 years before they have to make the decision premised on today. So let's say it's no less than 2 years to make the decision. If they're going to close, they've got a year to begin the closure. If they're going to convert, then they've got till 2015 to start the conversion. So this takes them out and gives them that opportunity to make a rational decision, and not with haste right now in these economic times.
The reason, if I could ask one more question, the reason I'm puzzled is these companies sent a letter to me saying they couldn't, and if they're saying they can, I just want to make sure we have some clarification of that somewhere in the record.
And reclaiming my time, with all fairness to all companies, and having been with an industry that lobbied the Congress, we don't want to do anything we don't have to do until we have to do it. But when the lines are drawn and the times are set, this is a reasonable compromise. They may not like it in total, but it gives them a period of time that is roughly 5 to 6 years to either make the conversion or to close the plant. And I think that's a fairly reasonable request. I would hope that they would agree with it, but if not, and they don't want the compromise, then I'm just trying to make a better deal for them so that they don't have to do it tomorrow. Rather than have some time going out. With that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back his time. Is there any other member who seeks to have any discussion on this amendment? The gentlelady from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you. If I could strike the last word. I just want to thank the gentleman for offering the amendment. I think it is a reasonable compromise. And the letter that I have from ASHTA does say that they, 36 months from the time the legislation is passed, they could do the conversion. And so now we're going to 2015. And I think that it strikes the right balance between protecting the public and also making sure that we have time for conversions and preserving the jobs. So I thank you very much, and would urge my colleagues to all on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment and then to support the bill. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there any other member who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from
Strike last word.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
First of all, I want to thank my colleague from Louisiana for trying to help and bringing more time. I would just go back to the letter that talked about how the initial bill would, in essence, close 4 chlor-alkali plants. But on the second page of this letter, it does say, in reference to, I think, an amendment pretty closely worded to what my friend from Louisiana has offered, is quoted as saying, the reality is that the timeline provided by this amendment is simply too short. The likely end result would be exactly the same as enactment of the original bill. In this economy, given the tremendous cost of a quick transition time, the companies would still be forced to close their plants. I'm not sure if that's exactly the language here, but I do applaud your efforts to try to bring some sanity to this, and I yield back my time.
If I could.
The gentleman yields back his time. Is there any other member?
No, if I could just, and I thank the gentleman, Mr. Shimkus. Where I was coming from is we're giving them roughly 3 years to make that decision, 3 years for the economy to perform one way or another, 3 years for hopefully the financial or the monies to be available. So there's no good time schedule, but this one I felt would compromise and give them the opportunity to make a rational decision at some point in the future. I yield back my time, and I thank the gentleman.
Are there any other members who seek recognition? Call us for the question. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Dr. Burgess, why do you seek recognition? For what purpose do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to consider 3 amendments in block: Radonovich 621, Radonovich 614, and Burgess 616. And Mr. Chairman, I'd also move that when the time comes, we divide the question for separate votes in that order.
The gentleman desires unanimous consent. Are there any objections? So ordered. The gentleman from...
and I thank the Chairman for the recognition. This, offering these 3 amendments in block, they all deal with the same problem. The difference is the degree of pain, the amount of bleeding, or the how high we will go on the misery index before we actually provide some relief. The First Amendment offered would provide a valuable safety mechanism for the already economically pinched communities that this legislation will affect. This bill specifically affects 4 plants and could force them out of business with unreasonable statutory requirements. Upgrading a chlor-alkali plant can cost upward of $100 million, a nearly unattainable sum given the current state of the financial industry as well as the current capacity in the chlorine and caustic soda industry. For the workers in these plants, this bill is a one-way ticket to unemployment. However, the effects of this bill won't just hurt the plant workers, but by robbing these Americans of their paychecks, we're also robbing their struggling families and their communities of their futures. This amendment would protect the workers by requiring the EPA administrator, in consultation with the Secretary of Labor, to submit a report to Congress by 2011 examining job loss from the Act. Should this bill's provisions cause more than 500 jobs to be lost, the Act would be permanently suspended to protect hardworking Americans. This recession has already been too hard on the American people. Let's not make it any harder with unfair new regulations. Now, if that is deemed as too restrictive at a 500 number on the job loss, Radonovich 614 requires that all 4 of the nation's remaining mercury cell chlor-alkali plants are in districts that have been devastated by the financial crisis. Augusta, Georgia is home to one of the plants, a staggering 11.5% unemployment rate. Another in Charleston, Tennessee, with a 10% unemployment rate. PPG in West Virginia with a 13.5% unemployment rate. And Ashta Chemicals plant in Ohio, a 13.5% unemployment rate. Driving these plants out of business with impossible mandates will have almost no effect on atmospheric mercury levels. These 4 plants combined emit less than 1/500th of the mercury emitted annually by China's coal industry alone, an industry which is growing exponentially. The people of this nation elected us to this Congress to fix their economic woes and their hardships, not to make them worse. Unfortunately, this bill will do just that. The amendment offered today would keep that promise to the people of America by requiring that the Environmental Protection Agency Administrator, in consultation with the Secretary of Labor, submit a report to Congress by 2011 examining job loss from this act. Should this bill's provisions cause more than 100 jobs to be lost, the act would be suspended and to protect hardworking Americans. So I would urge, if we cannot stop it at 500 jobs lost, perhaps we could consider at 100 jobs. And then finally, if even 100 jobs does not push up the misery index, what about if we just consider one plant? And this is Amendment Burgess 616. The 4 chemical plants this bill intends to run out of business now employ over 1,000 people and produce products essential for this nation's economy and the way in life. They do produce over 1,000 jobs, as well as crucial ingredients for high-tech first responder equipment, food protection chemicals, life-saving prescription drugs, as well as ensure a supply of clean drinking water. The plants produce 50% of our potassium hydroxide. Potassium hydroxide is a crucial ingredient for cleaning products, water treatment, particularly for the deodorizing of water, disinfectants, batteries, fertilizers, and runway de-icers. This final amendment will protect these jobs and our domestic supply of these valuable chemicals by requiring the Environmental Protection Agency Administrator to conduct a study by January of 2011 to determine if one or more of the plants forced to close as a result of this act. Should it find that a certain plant will be forced to close as a result of implementing this act, that plant would be exempted from compliance, thus preventing the closure and the loss of jobs. The closure of one plant would mean hundreds of jobs lost, and this economic climate, that is too many. These 4 communities are already suffering with an unemployment rate above 10%. 2 of these communities have unemployment rates of 13.5%. Preventing closure means saving jobs for these communities. I urge support of these 3 amendments, and I will yield back the balance of my time. Again, Mr. Chairman, I do move that when the time comes, we divide the question for separate votes in that order.
The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to these amendments. The amendment number 616 would permanently suspend all the provisions in this bill if the Environmental Protection Agency finds that any plants will close as a result of the bill's enactment. The amendment number 614 would permanently suspend all the provisions in the bill if the EPA finds that 100 jobs in the U.S. will be lost as a result of the bill's enactment. The amendment number 621 is similar, but would permanently suspend all the provisions in the bill if the EPA finds that 500 jobs will be lost as a result of the bill's enactment. This one-sided argument ignores any new jobs that will be created by investing in new modern technology. In addition, these amendments would in effect create a new loophole. It will allow an affected company to claim to EPA that job loss or closure is likely in order to avoid having to cut its pollution. The goal of this bill is to modernize these plants, not close them. 95% of chlorine plants in the U.S. already use a, quote, membrane cell, end of quote, technology that doesn't require the use of mercury. The rest of the world is trending in that direction. Japan completed a transition away from mercury-based facilities in 1986. India will complete its transition to mercury-free technology by 2012. China doesn't even have one mercury-based facility. The U.S. should have manufacturing facilities that are just as clean as Japan, China, or any other country. Investing in new technology is the key to a vibrant manufacturing future, not clinging to the old polluting technology of the past. If adopted, these amendments will allow these facilities to continue to pose a danger to public health and the environment indefinitely. I urge all of my colleagues to oppose these amendments. Is there any other member who seeks recognition? Who seeks recognition now? The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly here, I know that part of the discussion we had back and forth is how many jobs this bill would lose and how long it would take companies to make these transitions. This is not changing those deadlines for transitions, but I guess the situation is each side is saying that they think that it will be one time frame or another. Now, if that's the case, and one of the questions raised from the letter that I have in writing from these companies that they think they are going to lose 1,000 jobs from this is simply saying that if all these jobs are going to be lost, this is put on hold. And so it's not creating a loophole. It's just saying if people are so sure these plants can convert quickly and aren't going to lose jobs, then let's stand on the side of jobs and for the families involved with this. So with that, I support the amendment and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Illinois.
Thank you. I seek to strike the last word and just say that like most of my colleagues here, I share the concern about job loss in the face of a difficult economy, and that's why I was willing to compromise on the time. But to say that a law should be undone because the EPA administrator thinks jobs may be lost, which certainly isn't in the purview of the EPA administrator, and makes really no sense from a policy perspective. Also, converting to membrane cell technology will allow companies not only to retain jobs for the long term, the conversion process can also create hundreds of jobs in the short term. PPG's Lake Charles, Louisiana conversion to a mercury-free process provided jobs for over 250 workers who put in more than 450,000 hours of work to complete the task. So let's be clear that this legislation, this amendment, would undo all of the provisions. It would permanently say that these plants could exist and continue to polluting with mercury. We know that both PPG and Olin have already converted mercury cell facilities without terminating jobs, so the evidence is there, the compromise is in place, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from Louisiana, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
It's sad that we're debating or really negotiating how many jobs will be lost before we finally stop some of these policies that are running jobs out of this country. If you look what's happening right now in our economy, American people are most concerned about jobs. And yet this committee has spent an entire day passing a series of bills that will do nothing more than run more jobs out of this country, all under the guise of security and safety, when in fact the companies that are targeted by these bills spend millions and millions of dollars to increase safety, to invest in their facilities, to invest in their employees, and to invest in their communities. And yet they're under attack by this Congress, all under the guise of increasing these environmental policies, when people know that most of these policies are being pushed by radicals that really aren't concerned about safety. They're concerned about running a lot of these jobs out of this country. And this is a trend that's been going on. You can go back to the cap and trade bill, which by all estimates of any industry groups would run millions of jobs out of this country. And when you wonder why, after all of these policies that have been passed that we're all claiming to stop job loss, we've seen an increase in job loss. We're 9.8% unemployment, and it's continuing to trend up. It's because of policies like this. And you wonder why job growth in this country is stifled when businesses are sitting on the sidelines just wondering what's the next attack that's going to be thrown at them by Congress in terms of these policies. We should be trying to create jobs, not run more jobs out of this country. So I would support this amendment and hope that instead of negotiating how many jobs we're going to lose before we stop this madness, we just stop passing bad policies in the first place. So I'll yield back.
The gentleman would yield.
I'd yield to my colleague from Texas.
And I want to thank my friend for stating that so well. This may go down in history as the most anti-job Congress this country has ever seen. We have spent the day painting a target on 4 industries. And again, as Mr. Scalise correctly points out, we're just simply negotiating the number of jobs that are going to be lost. And yet, and when you combine that with the environment that we've created in this country, yes, with our cap and trade law, yes, with our health care bill that we're proposing, who knows what we're going to do on financial regulation? Who in their right mind would be out there looking to create a new job right now when you don't know what the next thing is the United States Congress is going to do to the country's employers, be they big employers or small employers? Everyone is similarly distressed. I, again, urge adoption of at least one of these 3 amendments. I think it is the same thing to do. It is unfortunate that we're here negotiating the number of jobs that we're willing to give up in this economy. The travesty is we should be working on creating jobs. The stimulus bill has been a failure. The money has been unspent. Here we have a chance today to save a few jobs. I think we should step up and do what's right for the American people, and I'll yield back.
The gentleman yield back.
Chairman.
Any members on this side seek recognition? Seeing none, the gentleman from Illinois is recognized. For what purpose?
Strike last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, I'll try to be quick, and thank you for your diligence. All this is an insurance policy. If we really want not to harm employment, if we do not want to harm the tax base in these communities, these are just amendments that say, okay, if there's job loss, if there's plant closures, we need to relook at this policy. The other frustration thing that we have in this whole fact is there are current rules and regulations that could achieve this stuff that are not being discussed. Have all the available remedies been exhausted under the Clean Air Act's Maximum Achievable Control Technology program relating to mercury releases in the air? Have they? I don't think we know the answer. Are we including the pending EPA rule for fugitive mercury emissions from these plants? Why aren't we using that process? Instead of amending TSCA, could mercury cell technology and the production of chlorine be phased out or eliminated via the MAC program? What about the Clean Air Act regulations? Here we, as my colleagues have said, we've got a bullseye on 4 industry, 4 locations who have said, we're going to close down. So I would say this is an insurance policy to be on record of if that's not the intent, then let's have an insurance policy. So I would support these 3 amendments. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Is there any other member who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, not wanting to delay the debate on the bill, but both of these amendments, and we had the similar amendments in our subcommittee last week. I guess my concern is that when you look at an amendment that says we're going to lose 100 jobs or 500 jobs or whatever, we don't want to lose any jobs. But we also don't want to produce a product that's endangering to the people who work there or the people who live around those facilities. And I guess we had this debate when the Occupational Health and Safety Administration may have been created. If employers and manufacturers want to produce a product unsafely, then we don't want them here. But if we want you here, we want you to do it right so you don't endanger the public. And that's what these amendments and these bills are about. We're not talking, we want jobs, and I'll put my job record up against anyone, but we want them to be safe, and we want them for the people who live around those plants to also be safe. So with that, these amendments, I think, are ones just, they're gotcha amendments. We had them last week in the subcommittee, and they're looking at it today. I don't want to put any tally on jobs because we don't lose any of them. But we also want these plants to produce their products safely. And I yield back my time.
Would my friend from Houston yield? Would I?
Sure.
If you don't want to, I don't.
Oh no, I'll be glad to, Joe. We've been here all day and on these, and that's why some of us are hesitant to get involved in the debate. But when you come up and you say, oh, if we're going to lose 500 jobs, I don't want to lose one job in my district because we've lost jobs.
Right.
But I also know that we want those manufacturers to produce their product, whether they be chemicals in my area or mercury somewhere else, but we want them to do it safely.
Well, the reason...
And that's what we're worried about. Are we throwing away safety because we want the jobs? I think those families of those employees who work there probably want them to be working in a safe environment. And the folks who live around those facilities, I know they want that product produced in a safe environment. So,
well, the reason that I asked, did my friend yield?
Did you yield? I yield.
I thought you did. Okay. The reason that I asked my friend from Houston to yield is because I know that you have a constituency that works in chemical processing. I don't know that you have any mercury facilities, but you're certainly a member in the majority that still understands the manufacturing process, the chemical process. And when you talk about the safety issue, I know that's something that you personally can take very seriously. But I'm not aware that there's been a safety issue at these plants. I think there was one plant that had a compliance problem, but it's been corrected. So I don't think the allegation from the author of the bill is that these plants are unsafe. There's obviously, we know that mercury as an element is harmful if it's used improperly or people are exposed to it above certain levels. But these plants seem to be in compliance. They use an older process. There are apparently better processes available, but those require substantial capital investment. So, what we're saying in these amendments is if you can't show something that's harmful, then we shouldn't implement the bill if these jobs are literally going to be lost.
Well,
I
and
would
I know
think
the
you would
reason
agree with
behind it, but I think the reason, though, is if there is a different process that can be done, and sure, it costs capital, but over a period of years, having run businesses, you can capitalize to change your processes. And this bill, I know this bill's been around for probably 4 terms in our committee, and it didn't pass when Democrats won the majority in 06, so it didn't pass in 07, in 08. But we're looking at it. There is a way that you can produce. I don't want to go back produce refined products. It's the cornerstone and chemicals of how we produced them 30 years ago or 40 years ago because it was dirtier and it was more dangerous. But you can capitalize, plan improvement over a period of years. And believe me, there's a reason to have mercury. But I also know that to make that argument is because everybody's worried about jobs now, and I worry about them too because we've lost jobs. We have well over 8% unemployment in my district that maybe other states wouldn't mind, but we're used to having 4% unemployment.
Well, the gentleman yield for.
But I also know that I want it to be done with the best possible processes over years. It's safe for both the people who work there, people who live around it.
Can I have the last couple seconds?
I think I have 6 sections. I'll be glad to yield to my colleagues.
Each of the plants has a fish consumption advisory near it, warning local residents of excessive mercury in the fish.
Are there any other members who seek recognition? The question is now before us. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. No. The noes have it. The noes have it. The noes have it. Oh, yeah, that's right. You divided the question. All right, let's redo this again since you divided the question. The question... All right.
You need to turn your microphone on.
If we're going to divide the question, I'm going to ask for a roll call vote. We can take the amendments in order, do the vote. If the first one passes, we don't need to take the vote on the remaining 2. If the second one passes, we don't need to take the vote on the third one.
All right, well, let's, yeah. Okay, the gentleman from Texas calls for a roll call vote on the amendment numbered 614.
621.
621. The gentleman calls for a roll call vote on the amendment 621. Amendment 621. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush.
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Ms. Taguette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy, Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley.
What's in the block mean?
Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton.
Aye.
Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Waxman.
No.
Waxman, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? If so, the clerk will tally it and announce it. wishes to respond to the vote?
Mr. Butterfield, not recorded. Mr. Butterfield, no.
Mr. Stupak wishes to be recorded.
Mr. Stupak votes no.
And I urge members to stay around because we're going to have 3 votes in a row. Clerk will announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 16, the nays were 31.
16 ayes, 31 noes. The amendment's not agreed to. Well, yes. Without objection. Okay. Objections heard.
Good try, though.
Clerk will call the roll. I thought it was a very constructive suggestion myself. The clerk will now call the roll on the next amendment. Which one is it?
Mr. Chairman, do you want me to call it on
614 by Mr. Radonovich.
All right. Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Mr. Walden? Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye.
Have all members responded to the vote? Clerk will tally the vote and announce it.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 15 ayes and 30 noes.
15 ayes, 30 noes. The amendment's not agreed to. We'll now proceed to the vote on 616 by Mr. Burgess. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Ms. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley? Ms. Braley, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch? Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shadegg? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Aye. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Mr. Walden? Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Clerk will tally the vote.
Not recorded. Do you want to be? Mr. Welch? No. Welch votes no. Okay. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 15 ayes and 30 nays.
15 ayes, 30 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Shimkus, you would like to present two amendments in block. Is that correct?
I would, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, that'll be the order. Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the staff's sake, it's TB 618 and TB 620. And for my colleagues, again, I'll be pretty short. I'm calling these in defense of chlorine, and they have a relationship to the previous bills that we've already discussed. They have a relationship to the Safe Water Drinking Act. They also have a relationship to Homeland Security. The First Amendment basically calls for this amendment would not allow Congress to regulate chlorine to a point of making germ-killing chlorine difficult to obtain or too expensive to buy. These facilities are chlor-alkali facilities. They produce chlorine. They use mercury in that process. Earlier, my colleague, Mr. Markey, and I talked about there was no intent to stop the chlorine use in the other bills. Part of the Safe Water Drinking Act debate was the fact of what is the cost going to be to small water facilities, especially rural, small town. And so what this amendment does is just says that if the cost of chlorine goes to a point that makes producing safe drinking water too expensive, this act would be determined null and void. Now, we all know that chlorine is the most highly efficient disinfectant, and it is added to public water supplies to kill disease-causing bacteria that the water or its transport pipes might contain. It's used in chlorine gas, liquid bleach, sodium chloride tablets. All of these are used in treatment of public water. Ensuring a domestic supply of chlorine ensures a safe drinking water supply. So that's the First Amendment. The Second Amendment addresses the Homeland Security concerns, especially the Ashta refinery, because as was testified to us before in the hearing, is that they provide chlorine to co-located facilities. So if that plant is required to close down, then what would occur? What will occur is that now chlorine will be transported over large distances, mostly in rail cars. Now, there are those who have as much concern, if not more concern, about chlorine gas over the rail systems, over the highway systems, as they have of the mercury issue. So especially with respect to this facility, when this facility closes, the other companies that surround it will have to import chlorinated gas, which could pose a Homeland Security concern. And so the Second Amendment would get EPA and the Department of Homeland Security to certify that the provisions of this bill are not making Americans less safe and security in their homes, at play, or on the road. It seems like a reasonable thing that we can do, especially since the bills that we've taken into account today on safe drinking water and Homeland Security. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair recognizes himself to speak in opposition to the amendments. The first one would suspend all the provisions of the bill if there's a finding that Homeland Security could be potentially impacted as a result of the bill's enactment. The bill before us is not intended to limit the use of chlorine nor close facilities that produce chlorine. It's about human health and not Homeland Security. Second Amendment would permanently suspend all the provisions of the bill if they find the supply of chlorine for disinfectant will adversely be affected as a result of the bill's enactment. Disinfecting drinking water is only one use of chlorine. If these plants convert, they will continue to make and sell chlorine. In fact, the production of chlorine has increased by 25% after conversion. The real harm is the continued use of mercury and what it will do to public health and environment. We have a disagreement. I would urge members to oppose the en bloc amendment. Are we ready for the vote? All those in favor of the amendments in bloc will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to.
Chairman, I request for a roll call vote.
Gentlemen, would the gentleman permit a show of hands?
No, sir. I'd like a roll call vote.
Okay. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shadig. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Upsons votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no.
All members have responded. The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 13, the nays were 26.
13 ayes,
26.
26 noes. The amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I have an inquiry of the chair.
Mr. Dingell, state your inquiry.
Mr. Chairman, how soon would you like the previous question moved?
We have one more en-bloc amendment that will be offered by Mr. Barton, and after that we will go to final passage. Do you have en-bloc amendments at the desk?
Mr. Chairman, I have amendment number 612 by Mr. Stearns and number 613, 612 by myself and 613 by Mr. Stearns that I would ask unanimous consent to be considered in block.
Without objection, the two amendments will be considered as in block, and further, without objection, they'll be considered as read, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes to speak
I would
in favor of the amendment.
yield to Mr. Stearns for such time as he may consume before I comment on my amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barton, let me say to my colleagues, this is an opportunity, I think, for a bipartisan bill, amendment. This is all about jobs, jobs, jobs. Many in this room voted for the stimulus package. Many have high unemployment in your congressional district across your state. What this amendment is about mercury pollution. But there's 4 plants in the United States that have mercury, that uses mercury for chlorine development. These plants account for only 5 millionths of 1% of atmospheric mercury levels. This bill is shutting down all 4 of these plants. When you go to the European Union, they have many, many more plants. They've taken a much better approach. They're phasing them down, not shutting them down. And why are they phasing them down rather than shutting them down? Because they're worried about loss of jobs. The managers, the executives from these 4 plants have said, if you shut us down, if this bill passes the way it is, we are going to shut our plants down. They're going to go overseas. So what we have here in my amendment is saying basically that we don't want these plants don't have to shut down. Why don't we follow the example of the European Union and let them phase down? Do what the European Union. Now, many on the other side has used the European Union as a forerunner for environmental policy, the paragon, so to speak, of what the future will be in the United States. So I say and appeal to you, why not follow the example of the European Union? Instead of shutting down these 4 plants and losing these thousands of jobs, why don't we go ahead and allow them to phase down, which is a much more appropriate way to do it. Will save jobs in this country. And when you realize there's 4 plants out of, these 50 states, it's a very small amount of manufacturing sector. And so these plants are not causing undue harm. So we can use some good common sense here. Save jobs. Let's do the right thing and adopt my amendment. I yield, Mr. Barton.
Well, thank you. I want to compliment the gentleman from Florida and simply say that these 2 amendments, one deals with China, one deals with the European Union. The European Union has 37 plants that use the same process that we're banning here in this bill. China, as far as we can tell, has no enforcement of mercury limitations. And so the Stearns Amendment says that we would suspend implementation of this act unless the European Union adopts the same standards in this act by 2011. And my amendment says that we would suspend the implementation of this act unless the Chinese government adopts mercury environmental limitations as stringent as they have in the United States. To the extent that there is data available, It appears that mercury contamination is primarily resulting from fish that are coming in from the Pacific Ocean, and the theory is that that ingestion of mercury in the fish is coming from mercury emissions because of coal-fired power plants in China. Now, that's not a fact, but that is the theory. So these two amendments, one says we don't implement it if the Europeans don't do the same thing for the 37 plants that use the same process, and the Barton Amendment says we don't implement it unless the Chinese adopt mercury restrictions as stringent as here in the United States. And I might just comment on the process briefly, Mr. Chairman. We've had 4 bills that were marked up today. The medical isotope bill we passed, I think, on a voice vote because it was bipartisan. Mr. Upton and Mr. Markey had worked on it. The other 3 bills, the water bill, the chemical plant bill, and the mercury bill, there is strenuous opposition. Strenuous. We think on the minority side that these are really bad public policy pieces of legislation. We got the markup notice at 8:39 Monday night, and we're marking them up at 10 o'clock Wednesday. So for my good friend, and he is truly my good friend, Mr. Dingell, to start talking about moving the previous question, the minority has acted, I think, very responsibly. We're going to finish this markup in approximately 7 hours when we barely had the minimum 36-hour notice, and 3 of the 4 bills are extremely controversial. If we had really wanted to delay this markup, we could have done it. So we're trying to make a point for the public and the country, but we understand the majority has the right to set the agenda, and we understand the majority has the right to move the bills that the majority feels needed to be moved. But we on the minority feel we have a responsibility to at least engage in a debate and show what the issues are. So on these 2 amendments, I would ask for a yes vote, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes himself. Let me just say that all 3 of these bills had consideration in subcommittee. There were hearings in subcommittee. There was a markup in subcommittee. The debate in subcommittee was very much like the debate here. I have to wonder what the purpose of a subcommittee is if we do a markup and then repeat every single amendment and then add a few more when we get to full committee. It makes me think we ought to just go to one committee.
Would the gentleman yield on that point?
Yes.
Well, I would hope if we make the points in subcommittee, there would be some interaction between subcommittee and full committee where the majority and the minority would try to work together to find a compromise. That did, in these 3 bills, that did not happen, Mr. Chairman, which is why you have some of the same debate at full committee that we had at subcommittee.
I know that there's controversy, and evidently the differences could not be bridged, although this is the bill where there was a compromise in a period of time in which for these 4 facilities to finally get around to making the changes on the chlorine levels that all the 95% of the plants had already done. The intensity of your feelings comes across by the intensity and the logic of your debate, whether we agree with it or not. But spending 7 hours debating something that was already marked up in a subcommittee doesn't seem to me to add a lot. You're under the rules, and it's proper to offer amendments, but I just would urge that members think in terms of narrowing the issues when we get to full committee, not keeping them just as broad. On the substance of the 2 amendments, with all respect, I just have to disagree with you. To say that we're not going to do anything in the United States unless China adopts a policy as well, when it isn't a global problem, it's a problem in a locality when you have this mercury exposure. And it's particularly amazing because China doesn't even have one of these chlor-alkali facilities. So telling them they've got to adopt a law before we'll do something in the United States to protect the health of the American people here just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I know that, according to Mr. Stearns, the European Union is ahead of us. Well, that may or may not be the case, but we need to adopt our own laws. And I think that the bill before us doesn't need to depend on the European Union to pass a law before we decide to pass a law to protect our own people. For that reason, I would urge opposition, and we'll proceed to a roll call vote. If you want a roll call vote? Yes, sir. Okay. How many members want a roll call vote? Sufficient number want a roll call vote. We'll go to the roll call vote.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Inslee? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Wiener? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shadig? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack? Mr. Walden? Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess? Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye.
Mr. Rush, how do you wish to vote?
Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush votes no.
Any other member wish to be recorded? If not, the clerk will tally the vote so we can move on to the final vote for passage.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 13 and the nays were 28.
13 ayes, 28 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. The vote now comes on reporting H.R. 2190 as amended with the recommendation the bill pass. Well, we'll proceed to a roll call vote.
Mr. Wax?
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Shadig. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bonomack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye.
Have all members responded? Follow the roll.
Mr. Markey votes aye.
I bet he did.
Burgess, did you vote? Burgess, are you recorded?
Mr. Burgess is recorded.
Okay. Any member wish to be recorded who has not yet spoken up? If not, the clerk will tally the vote. The clerk will tally the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 29 ayes and 14 noes.
29 ayes, 14 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. No, 29. The bill is reported out. 29 ayes. This bill has been voted out. And so therefore, without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming corrections to all the bills approved today. And that completes our business, so we stand adjourned.
Quitting time.